afternoon, everybody. This is Mildred here, your counselor for today. I'm here to explain about the review of yesterday's topic, that is an overview of the period between 1600 to 1857. I'll take you through. Let us go firstly through the PowerPoint presentation. Beginning with the age of the initial contact between 1498 to 1600, while in 1498, it marks the arrival of the Portuguese Vasco da Gama. It set the stage for the European competition. For the next century, English was virtually unheard of in the subcontinent. The linguistic landscape was dominated by the Persian and the court language of the Mughals, and various vernacular regional languages were used. And the merchant's tongue, which happened to be between 1600 to 1757, with the Charter Act and of the East India Company in 1600, the arrival of English as the language of commerce. And then there was the factors language. In the early days, the factories like trading posts like Surat, Madras, and Kolkata, which is now presently known as Kolkata, which was called Calcutta, and English was used solely for ledger books and business correspondence. And the interpreters being the Britishers, who were forced to they forced to learn local languages or to rely on the Dubashes as the interpreters between the one who spoke a pidgin English. At this stage, there was no intent to spread the language. It was basically a tool for profit. The age of the initial contact between 1498 to 1600, which marks the arrival of the Portuguese in 1498, Vasco da Gama, it set the stage for the European competition. Thus, for the next century, English was virtually unheard of in the subcontinent. The linguistic landscape was dominated by Persian and the court language of the Mughals and the various regional vernaculars. As we heard that there were the different types of vernacular languages used by the places in Surat, Madras, Kolkata. As English was used, but they had the local languages which were used by the people who were traders and the local culture. The merchant's tongue, which happened to be in 1600 to 1757, with the Charter Act with the Charter of the East India Company in 1600, the English arrived as a language of commerce. The factors language in early the factories like we already mentioned, Madras, Calcutta, Surat, that's where English was used solely for ledger books and business correspondence. The interpreters, the Britishers, were forced to learn local languages. And they're called the Pidgin English, who spoke Pidgin English. The roads of institutionalization between 1813 to 1833. During these 2 decades, a fierce debate erupted within the British administration regarding the direction of Indian education. The rise of Indian intelligentsia, the influential Indians among notably were Raja Ram Mohan Roy, who began campaigning for English education. Though he was Indian, they viewed it as a gateway to Western knowledge, the philosophy, Western science, and political ideas that could modernize Indian society. The administrative necessity, as the British Empire grew, it became too expensive to staff every clerical position with Englishmen. The East India Company needed a class of English speaking Indians to serve as the cheap backbone of the colonial bureaucracy. Thus, in 1833, the turning point which happened, the Charter Act in 1833 removed all restrictions on European settlement and solidified the need for a uniform uh, authority to be placed in India. And the administrative necessity as the British Empire grew, it became too expensive to staff every clerical position with ungallant Englishmen. The East India Company needed a class of English speaking Indians to serve as a cheap backbone to the colonial bureaucracy. The, as I said, as I mentioned before, the turning point, which happened, the Charter Act, it solidified, and the Charter Act in 1833 removed the restrictions of European settlement, which solidified the need to uniform administrative language. They paved the way for the famous Macaulay's Minute in 1835, which officially ended the debate by declaring that a single shelf of a good European library was worth the whole native literature of India and Arabia. So now we're going back to our book, which is the pre-transportation age. And we know that, like we already mentioned below above that, the Aryans came to settle down in the Indian subcontinent, and the languages which were spoken were Sanskrit became the most important language of ancient India. And the Muslims also came from outside and they settled down in the subcontinent. And Hindi and Punjabi was spoken, and between Persian and Sanskrit languages like Hindi and Punjabi resulted in Urdu language, and thus Urdu became the byproduct of the interaction between two languages and cultures. And during the pre-transportation age in 1600 to 1813, the great discovery, as we already know, that Vasco da Gama came to India by the sea route in 1498. That was the advent of Europeans. The Portuguese, the Dutch, the French, and the English came to India and held the gorgeous East in fee for more than a century. They established colonies and never settled down in the subcontinent. They were only colonizers and traders to begin with, and they never tried to import languages. The charter for the East India Company, which is 1.2.1. Queen Elizabeth signed the Charter Act on the last day of 1600, establishing the East India Company and granting a monopoly of the English commerce and East Indian and Pacific Ocean on the territories occupied by the Portuguese and the Spaniards. The Macaulay's Minute, that's as we were mentioning about Macaulay's Minute, which became the turning point. The Christian missionaries were very active in the 18th century, and their main aim was conversion. They used education as a means to that end. They started some educational institutions in India, but the medium of instruction was not English. The British became more powerful, and consequently, English became the language of the British bureaucracy. Macaulay's Minute in 1835 became the blueprint of English education in India. Mr. Macaulay was the member of the Council of India and the president of Public Instruction of the Indian Committee of Public Instruction. His plans of dissemination of European knowledge and sciences through the medium of English among one section of the people of India was readily accepted by the government of William Bentinck. As often quoted from the lines of Macaulay's Minute are, we must present ourselves to do our best to form a class of people who may be interpreters between us and the millions who govern a class of persons, Indian in blood and colour, but English in taste, in opinions, in morals, and in intellect. To that class we may leave it to redefined the vernacular dialects to our country to enrich those dialects with the terms of science borrowed from Western nomenclature to render them to, by degrees, fit vehicles for conveying knowledge to the great mass of the population. In 1857, there was the establishment of unit. As we can go down to the page 4 of 1.4 in 1857, 1.4 of 1857, where we see the establishment of universities. At the stroke of it, at the stroke of 12, the English became the language of the government, education, and advancement as a symbol of the colonial rule. As a result of this policy, English teaching universities were established in Bombay, Madras, and Calcutta in 1857. This is also called the year of mutiny. By the end of the 19th century, with more colleges and universities set up, English became the prestige of language of the Indian subcontinent, completely replacing Persian, Sanskrit, Hindi, and other languages of India. Now, coming on to the key drivers of the expansion. To sum up all this, before we sum up all this, the Aryans came to India as Indian subcontinent and settled down for education advancement. They settled down the language and literature, which may be called the settlers, the language and literature. The Muslims came to India and partly settled down, and the Persian did not come to as Indian language. As a result of this interaction between Persian and Sanskrit based languages is Urdu, a language mostly used in the subcontinent. The, the key drivers of the expansion. The key drivers of the expansion are the missionaries, the organizations like Ceremo, Cerem 4 Mission believed that English was the vehicle for spreading Christianity and enlightening the East. They established the first modern schools and printing press. Indian reformers like Rajaram Mohan Roy argued that Sanskrit and Persian education were backward looking. They viewed English as a window to modern sciences, mathematics, and democratic ideals. The utilitarians and Whigs, the British officials like James Mill and Lord Macaulay, wanted an efficient, inexpensive bureaucracy. They needed a class of local clerks who could bridge the gap between the British rulers and the Indian public. As we know, 15th and 16th centuries, the Portuguese, the Dutch, the French, and the English came to India basically as traders and establishing colonies in the Indian subcontinent. The Portuguese had a base in Goa, the Dutch in Masulipatam and Pulicat, the French in Pondicherry, and English in Bengal and Chennai. The East India Company was established in 1600, and that marks the beginning of the pre-transportation stage of English in India. The East India Company didn't show any interest in education at all. In 1813, The East India Company was brought under the control of the British Parliament and it started showing interest in education. The Charter Review of 1853 established an open competition system and of public examination. In 1835, Macaulay's Minute, as I've already mentioned before, at the stroke, English became the language of the government in 1857. Three universities were established, and English became the medium of instruction and education at the higher levels. 1857 was also called the year of Great Mutiny. I'm talking about 1600 to 1813, which was the pre-transportation phase, the, the advent of the Europeans and the Charter Act, the power struggle, charter renewal, and all these. Here we are here to understand the historical forces of the power struggle that prevailed during the transportation period before 1600. And we are here to understand how the history of India, with the particular reference to the introduction of English in India, and to comprehend the lingual, and multicultural context in the Indian subcontinent as a result of various invasions. The Indian subcontinent, comprising now what we call in India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, they absorbed several invasions in the past, which resulted in several layers of language and culture in the subcontinent, and English was one of those layers. Talking about that during that period, the Aryans came to India and settled down. They were called settlers. They were not just conquerors. They were and colonizers. Their language was Sanskrit, which meant carefully made or perfected, was the literary language and high speech. The influx, this influx of the first Aryan languages speaking tribes probably took place in the second half of the second millennium, that's in the BC, and later the Prakrits, the vernaculars and the dialects the dialects. They developed most important dialects. Pali became the language of the Buddhist and Jain thought and literature. Sanskrit became the representation of Brahmin civilization, while the Prakrits developed into several languages of the common people like Hindi, Gujarati, Punjabi. These languages were written in Devangari script. So the Aryans who came down and settled in the Indus valleys, making it a civilization. We knew that they were spread with the buried towns, which is Mohenjo-daro and Harappa, and they spread towards the east and the south. This long process of urbanization in India's subcontinent pictured in the Vedic literature. The Punjabis, they receded in importance, and Madhya Desa became the holy land of the Hindus. The culture of Aryans is strong, rich in potentially and typically Indian. The Sanskrit literature contains words dealing with drama, history, philosophy, grammar, astronomy, algebra, medicine, and jurisprudence. Some of the most important names are Kalidasa, Sakuntala, Meghadatta, etc. Subandhu, Vasudev, Vasu, Vaswadatta, the Ramayana, Vaisya, the Mahabharata, Panini, and Aryabhatta. Harsha was the last great Hindu emperor in the northern India. He died in 647, and after his death, the grand empire he built collapsed. and was split into small kingdoms. For nearly 2 centuries, there was confusion, and for 4 centuries, between 800 to 1200 AD, nearly all the kingdoms were governed by the Rajput families. They were torn by mutual jealousy and bitterness and were seldom at peace. Their power, but they were perpetual feuds that prevented their union and destroyed all chances of offering any united resistance to the Muslims and when they invaded the Indian subcontinent. So, the reports of some of the Arab merchants about the fabulous wealth and luxuries of India excited the greed of the Arabs, and repeated conquests were attempted upon the coast of India. In 1001 AD, over into India. In 1017, he started with a huge force appeared before Mathura. These great shrines are believed to be looted and razed to the ground. He ransacked Somnath too. He returned to Ghazni with rich spoils. His successors did more or less the same. Only in 1200 AD the Delhi Sultanate was established. The history of Muslims' progress in the Indian subcontinent can be divided into two periods. One is the period of conquest and the administrative experiment. The second is the period of imperial glory and achievements by the great Mughals from Babur, who led between 1526 to 1530, to Aurangzeb, who ruled between 1658 to 1700. The Mughal dynasty ruled for Delhi. Now, talking about the advent of Europeans who arrived in India was Vasco da Gama, who was a new trade route to India in 1498. Then, the first among the European nations to intrude into the new field was Portugal. The Portugal established a number of settlements, the Malabar coast, the scene of the early activities, since they were rich in spice and they produced of Ceylon, Malacca, and Spice Island on one hand, and the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea and East Africa on the other. Now, coming to the Charter Act and the power struggle, Queen Elizabeth signed the Charter Act of 1600. Queen Elizabeth signed the Charter Act 1600, granting the East India Company a monopoly of all English commerce in India and the Pacific Oceans, except the territories occupied by the Portuguese and the Spaniards. So, from the beginning, the company passed through many years of prosperity and adversity in. And finally, in the middle of the 18th century, a strong challenge and the attempts of the French domination in the Indian subcontinent. The British also established powerful factories and trading centers in important places and in the coast. So all these were organized under three presidencies, namely Bombay, Madras, and Bengal. That is Calcutta. Now, talking about, let's go to what we have read about reaching out to Surat, Pondicherry in 1674. And first, we will go down to 1813, which was the Charter Act renewal, which happened, and the Indians were to follow the pattern of educations in the Pathasalas and Madrasas, and the Persian schools called the Maktabs were formed, and the other school teachings were by the modern Indian languages, and educations in temples, domestic education, and the Gurukuls were on the basis of what English termed indigenous education. Almost till the end of the 18th century, Only when the company became the political power as part of its tendency towards enduring Her Majesty's government to the natives, some of the centers of learning were started and the Christian missionaries were allowed to take educational activities in order to spread Western light and knowledge and to instruct the Gentiles that we wish shall be servants and slaves of the same company of their agents in the Protestant religion. So the East India Company had a status of Jagirdars under the Mughal sovereigns. In 1757, the victory of the Battle of Plassey gave them political strength, and within Diwani Act of 1765, the British became the virtual rulers of Bengal. They fought many battles and they rarely won any until 1798. Now, the missionaries became active in the 18th century. Their main aim was prosel- pros- proselytization, which means the end of the Indian languages, not English. For example, William Carey, an English missionary, brought out its book on Sanskrit grammar, an English translation, the Ramayana, and also started a newspaper in Bengal in 1818. So, this is what was done by William Carey. He has translated a lot of English translation of the Ramayana and the newspaper in Bengal in 1818. I'm at 2.5, the use of English during this period and the House of Commons, the British government, the day submitted the series of resolutions in the House of Commons, yeah, yeah, providing the renewal of the company's charter for another 20-year period. One resolution, the cabinet advanced the idea that the education of natives in India was an incumbent upon the British government. Hither, only the European only the European Enlightenment and diffusion of Christianity in India can save the native families. This was a grave departure from the religious neutrality of the company. Hitherto, whatever had been done in the name of the company for the education of the natives and was very little had been left solely to the discretion of the Governor General at Calcutta. The introduction of education was the obligation derived from the duty of Great Britain to pronounce the interests and happiness of the native inhabitants. It authorized the Governor General to spend 1 lakh rupees, that is 10,000 pounds annually, on the revival of the improvement of literature and the encouragement of the learned natives in India, and for the introduction and promotion of the knowledge of sciences among the inhabitants of the British territories in India. So, in short, the Renewal Act of 1813 provided statutory sanction of regularly, yearly educational expenditure, and at the same time it removed the restrictions against the missionary enterprise. It was one thing to formulate the policy in London, And it was another thing to put the policy to effect thousands of miles away, that is in India. Warren Hastings, while he was a Governor General between 1772 and 1785, he courted popularity among the natives by patronizing Hindu and Muslim learning in Bengal. His interest to encourage introduction of English education at the expense of the older policy of Warren Hastings. Mass education in English was considered impractical. So, however, liberal education for the upper and middle classes in larger cities won favor with the court of the directors because it promised the supply of cheap native labor for government employment and would probably indoctrinate the minds of those who influence the rest of the community was extensive, so it adopted this policy. The first phase of history of India, as we are on 2.5 of uh, we are going through English in India and the discipline specific elective course, which is D, as we are already going through it in the first phase of the history of English in India. The interaction in English was between two disparate systems. One hand were the Indian rulers with their politicking intrigues and internal feuds for maintaining territorial control, and on the other hand, the British merchants who were trying to become rulers. The interlocutors, who were mainly the feudal chiefs, their courtiers, the higher rung of the feudal court hierarchy, and the East India Company. The locale was urban, and the feudal power center. The interaction mainly related to the political usurpation of the Indian states, which gave the EIC the territorial control necessary for trading. Thus, the East India Company, the political usurpation led to the emergence of the British bureaucracy, which induces the use of English for certain restricted written functions. And like the male style used in the earlier forms, the effect they were Indian subcontinent must have tasted effective vocabulary which was found in the petitions during the this phase. The first, as we can see, Dr. Raja Manikchand's letter to Colonel Clive, which were in the Indian records, which you can refer to 2.5.1, the data on 2.5.1, the domains being the political and its extensions, bureaucratic and commercial. I repeat, 2.5.1, the data, the domains being political and its extensions, bureaucratic and commercial. The specimen 1, the political diplomacy, an extract from from Raja Manikchand's letter to Colonel Clive. The source was Indian records, the series Bengals in 1756 to 57. You may read the letter which is on posted on 23rd December 1756. To I have had the great pleasure, I have had the pleasure to receive your most friendly letter. To hear you in good health gives me the sincerest pleasure. You're sending a copy of your address to the Naboob enclosed in your letter to me for my perusal. I esteem as an instance of your friendship, finding in it may improper expressions and concluding that by sending me the copy you desired to know my sentiments upon it, and I therefore have some alterations in it, and return entrusted to Radha Kisan Malik, who will deliver it to you. I will forward it to Naboob. You write that you are desirous of peaceable measures. I likewise am as desirous as nothing is better than peace. To always take every cause of ill will or contention. This is the part of a good man. For the rest of you will be informed from Radha Kisan of my further sentiments. You write that you send three letters, which are in brackets for the Naboob, one from yourself, one from Asidbad Dawla, and one from Aranvedi Khan. Two of these I have received, but one from Anarvedi Khan is missing. Perhaps by some mistake it may not have been sent. This is this I have thought proper to acquaint you with. I hope you will continue to inform me of your health and look upon me as your well-wisher. So this is the kind of letters which was done in the year 1756, which is an extract of Manik Chand to Colonel Clive Lloyd. And the specimen which was which you need to know about is very important in your kind of vocabulary which was used during the point of time during 1756. Now coming on to the period between 1857 to 1904, which makes you aware of the post of the 1857 phase, which may be called the dissemination phase. You may also look critically of the spread of English education in Indian subcontinent and show the link between the British bureaucracy and the use of English. So the crown, which you already are aware of, which took over from the East India Company and the British government with its departments and bureaucracy, along with the show off its value in the society. So English became the language of the government, and Indians are subjects, accepted to the governing the authority and the language of the rulers. So for further stabilization and expansion during the third phase of history, which happened, and the second phase was between 1813 to 1815, became stable and stabilized the new domain which was added, and the certain amount of diversification which were there among the domains. For example, there were more compartments within the bureaucracy, and the departments also formed Indian formed, and Indians took over the bureaucratic in network or at various levels. So now talking about the Indians do to vacillate between the acceptance and rejection of the English. Uh, they perceive certain advantages and the use of English, but they want to reap the advantages without being excommunicated from their own social cultural milieu. So the problem of the using Indians, English using Indians seems to be how to accommodate English with the socio-economic advantages within the native cultural pattern. Apparently, the use of English in the bureaucratic domain is treated as a convenient way of using English for formal impersonal communication in English induced certain in areas. The bureaucratic use of English thus becomes the impersonal module of communication. And this modular function of English is an important pointer in the developments in the latter years, wherein English comes to be treated to a module in the outer areas of life according to the needs of Indians. There were IAS officers, but English began with the serve to purpose of during this phase. The English Indian National Congress was founded during this period of 1885, and there were also some militant associations like the Indian Associations, which was formed by the expelled ICS officer Surendranath Banerjee, and in 1876, Indians began reacting to the British government using the language of the rulers. So all we have gotten to understand here about the Indian subjects accepted the governing authority and the language of the rulers. The number of colleges rapidly increased, and education meant English education. So there was rapid expansion and stabilization of English and English education. English became more and more of an urban bureaucratic phenomena, and it did not interact with the native culture of the Indian subcontinent like religion, social customs, etc. English gave Indians some socio-economic advantage, and English became another vehicle for expressing some aspects of Indian thought. So we are at Wood's Dispatch, which happened in 1854, the Magna Carta, which is at 3.2. You may refer to 3.2, the Indian education system, the Indian Education Commission in 1854. That's by Charles Wood's Dispatch, which is a recommended a system of education and unplanned expansion. As a result of the dispatch, a commission was set up to review the pros and cons of education in the Indian subcontinent. If Macaulay provided the philosophy, Sir Charles Wood provided the structure. Wood's dispatch created the organized educational hierarchy that exists in a similar form today. Primary schools, local languages at the village level. High schools, Anglo vernacular mixed languages. Colleges and universities, English was used as a sole medium of instructions. So this was what happened during the Charles Wood's dispatch, that is the Magna Carta, which led to the establishment of the first three major universities between 1857, Calcutta, Bombay, and Madras, recommending primary elementary education. But the government ignored this recommendation. The commission recommended and reconfirmed the university policy of education, which was accepted by the government. The government, after 1884, the commission was submitted the report. Then the commission recommended and confirmed the university policy of education, which was accepted by the government. And higher education, there was a gap between the higher education and elementary education. It widened. The vast majority of people became more and more illiterate. Only the urban elite and the middle class got English education. So let us sum up. Before we sum up, let us go down to the downward filtration theory. What do we mean by the downward filtration theory? The British initially followed the downward filtration theory. They believed that by educating the upper and the middle class in English, Western culture and refined ideas would naturally filter down to the masses. So they largely failed to educate the general public. So instead of creating massive cultural and linguistic divide between English educated elite and the rest of the population. So to sum up, the Indian Education Commission confirmed the policy of higher education, and it recommended improving primary education, and government also ignored it, and the result primary education also got neglected. In 1902, the universities, there were about 200 arts and professional colleges, and about 195 of them were teaching English and through English. By 1902, the Indian Universities Commission was set up, and in 1904, the Indian Universities Act came into force, and this act tightened the government control and over the universities and colleges administration and provided funds for setting up more facilities in the colleges and universities. So the Indian Universities Act, which is in 1904, they came into force, and which was the landmark, the piece of legislation which was introduced during the Viceroyalty Lord Curzon. While it was aimed to reform and elevate the standards of higher education, it became one of the most controversial acts of the colonial era during the political rule. So we are at where we are talking about coming on to the block two. Uh, we are ending with 3.3, where we are going to begin and beginning of 1904. Yes. By the turn of 20th century, why was it introduced? There were some undertones to elevate and to reform the standards of higher education. The turn off for 20th century, the British became the wary of the growing national sentiment in India. Many of the leaders of the independence movement were products of the university system established by British dispatch. Curzon believed that universities became factories producing political revolutionaries. The quality of education had declined due to the focus on rote learning and exams rather than research. The quality of education declined. Why did it decline? Let me let me review. It is declined due to rote learning and reinforced that the exams were rather than learning on rote learning rather than and exams rather than research. Private colleges were poorly managed due to an lack of funds and lack discipline. To this, he appointed the Relay Commission in 1902, which notably had no Indian members initially until Syed Hussain Belgrami and Justice Gurdas Banerjee were added later. The Act of 1904 was based on the recommendations of this commission. The key provisions or the acts fundamentally changed the governance and the Indian universities. Universities no longer just an examining body. They were now empowered to appoint their own professors and lecturers and promote study research. They reduced the Senate size, and the number of fellows in the university senates were drastically reduced. And reviewing what we have learnt yesterday, the government gained the power to nominate the majority of these fellows, ensuring the British control over the decision making. There were stricter affiliation rules, veto power, and territorial reviews, territorial limits. The backlash which happened, and why did Indians oppose it? The act met with fierce resistance from the Indian nationalists, including Gopal Krishna Gokhale, who was called who called it the retrograde measure. The the imperialization of education. Nationalists saw the act as an attempt to turn universities into government departments by controlling the Senate and the affiliation. The British could suppress subversive political ideas, limiting their growth by the strict affiliation rules. It made it difficult for Indian run private colleges to survive, which was seen as a way to limit the spread of education among the masses. Lack of autonomy. The act of effectively ended and the academic independence to institutions like the Calcutta Madras and Bombay University. So now we are going to go back to the imperialization and we will be going through the second block, which is from 1913 onwards, the recommendations of the Commission. Okay, let us review all that happened between 1913 to 1990. All the different, the main um, contingents of the history of English in Indian education in India. Let us refer to 1913, which was the resolution of Indian educational policy that recommends the needs for the establishing new universities, and six more established in 1913 to 1920. And let's talk about 1921. Department of Education transferred to the control of Indian ministers. The Indian University, which was established, Inter-University Board established in 1925. 1920 36 to 37, the Education Department, including the bureaucratic network that controlled education, taken over by Indians. And 1944, the Advisory Board submitted its plan for education and it recommended English be made a second language and that the mother tongue be the medium of instruction to high school level. Now, talking about 1946 to 1947, there was an expansion of education, primary schools, degree colleges, universities. All these were the types of institutions, and their figures in 1946 to 47 were 134 to 134, 1,34,866, 3,85,000 in 1939. The degree colleges were 231 and the primary schools were 93,604 in 1901 to 1902. Degree colleges were 231 in 1921 and the universities there were 5 universities in 1916 and in figures there were 19,000. So let's the print media which was happened in 1937 to 47 were rapid increase in newspapers and periodicals. In 1937, there were 32 English dailies and English weeklies, there were 32. In 1947, there were English dailies, there were 51, and there were English weeklies, there were 258. In 1908, K.C.R. Roy, the Indian established India, first new agency associated with the Press of India, taken over by the Government of India in 1947. So in 1919, there were Reuters, the international agency, and the Eastern Agency, with K.C. Roy as the director. Sadanand was for free press in 1933. In 1936, the Government of India took over broadcasting, separate office, and set up funds allocated. In 1937, there were provincial centers and urban and semi-urban areas, and teleprinter system of API. Thus, there was first teleprinter. In 1947, the Ministry of Education was constituted in Delhi. In 1948, University of Education Commission by Dr. Radhakrishnan as the chairman of the commission included 3 foreigners, Sir James Duff from Durham and directors Morgan and Tigret from USA. In 1950, the Constitution of Grants of English the status of the Associated English official language. An Indian Institute of Technology in Kharagpur was established in 1951. In 1951, the Institute of Technology was adopted in established in Kharagpur. The University Grants Commission was formed autonomous status granted by the Parliament in 1956. And 19 60, the committees of experts, that is GC Banerjee, and had to examine the issues involving the teaching of English. In 1958, Hyderabad established the Central University of English. Central Institute of English, Hyderabad, was established with the cooperation of the British Commission and Council and the Ford Foundation. So we have the NCERT, which was found in 1961. The Emotional Grant Integration Commission, by the chairman by Dr. Sampurnanand, was recommended as a linked language between English and Hindi should be effectively taught in the university level. In 1963, Official Language Act as the associate language without any limit. In 1961, official languages, the amendment bill was statutory and continues the use of English. In 1968, the National Policy of English embodies recommendations like Kothari Commission report, and the study of regional languages was made for textbooks, the study of English to continue as alternative language and the medium of instruction at high levels. The council constitutional amendment places education on concurrent list in 1976. And in 1979, the draft national policy of education, the three language formula was implemented at the secondary stage and in the entire country, which included the study of modern Indian language, preferably South Indian language. In addition to formulate the simple Hindi in Hindi speaking states and Hindi in addition of the regional language and English in non-Hindi speaking states. These were targeted for implementing the new education policy envisaged in 1979 draft 1986 to 87. The the POE and NEP, the National Policy of Education and the Plan of Action in 1986 was recommended dynamic approach. In 1989, we had the university handbook in 1989, and there were 120 universities, deemed universities, and 26 agricultural universities. These 169 university ties employed with 234,000 teachers, and the teaching and research enrollment of the students for degrees, diplomas, that was 3.5 million. 1990, Acharya Ramamurthy Commission the commission was set up to review the NPE and POA, the plan of action, and then the national policy of education. These were the endorses of the recommendations of 1986 report to the language formula. Thus, we have gone through uh, the main objectives of it were the different planned commissions and the things that have been happening between the 1498 to 1600, and then we went down to the year 1990, which were the contingent of the history of English in India. And tomorrow we will be going through the Indian Education Commission formed by Wood's Dispatch. We will review again tomorrow the effect of the Wood's Dispatch and the vernacular, the failure of the vernacular education, and the Universities Act Commission Act in 1904. So thanks and have a great day. हो गया?